The Wyoming winter of 1887 was merciless, claiming lives as easily as it claimed cattle. When Silas Hart, the territory's wealthiest rancher, collapsed with fever in a snow-filled ravine, he expected to die alone, like so many men before him. But Emma Price found him first. Heavy with child and miles from anywhere, this young schoolteacher made a choice that would change two lives forever. She dragged his burning body to an abandoned line shack and nursed him through 3 days of howling blizzard. In that tiny refuge, with only firelight between them and the frozen death outside, something remarkable happened. The hardened cattle baron and the gentle teacher began to share their deepest fears and dreams. Silas had built an empire, but lived in isolation. Emma carried new life, but faced an uncertain future alone. As the storm raged, they discovered that wealth means nothing without someone to share it with, and that courage sometimes wears a schoolmarm's dress. When the snow cleared, both faced impossible choices. Could a man known only for his ruthless business sense find redemption in small acts of kindness? What happens when two wounded souls discover that sometimes salvation comes not from gold or land, but from the simple decision to care for another human being? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks before Emma Price would find Silas Hart dying in that snow-filled ravine, the cattle baron sat in his study, reviewing the deed to his vast ranch. The document bore his name in bold letters across 15,000 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land. But tonight, the paper felt cold as winter stone between his weathered fingers. Silas Hart had built his empire through calculation and iron will. At 42, he commanded respect across the territory, not through friendship but through fear. Men tipped their hats when he rode through Cheyenne. Bankers cleared their schedules for his appointments, and smaller ranchers watched their boundaries carefully when his riders approached. He owned more cattle than any man between Denver and Billings, employed 24 cowboys, and could buy or sell most businesses in 3 counties. Yet as he sat alone in his grand house this December evening, surrounded by fine furniture shipped from Chicago and paintings that cost more than most men earned in a year, Silas felt the hollow ache that had grown stronger with each passing season. The house echoed with emptiness. His meals were taken in solitude. His victories were celebrated alone. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 20 years building walls around his land, around his heart, around his very soul. Now those walls had become a prison of his own making. The story of how Silas Hart became the loneliest wealthy man in Wyoming began with tragedy. At 22, he'd arrived in the territory with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from his father's failed farm in Missouri. His young wife, Sarah, had been pregnant with their first child, full of dreams about their new life in the West. But the harsh realities of frontier life had claimed them both, Sarah in childbirth, the baby 3 days later, leaving Silas with grief so profound it nearly broke him. Instead of breaking, he'd hardened. He threw himself into building the ranch with single-minded fury, as if success could somehow fill the void their deaths had carved in his chest. He bought land aggressively, sometimes forcing out smaller homesteaders through legal maneuvers that stayed just this side of honest. He hired the best cowboys and paid them well, but kept them at arm's length. He built the finest house in the county, then filled it with expensive things that meant nothing to him. Men called him ruthless, and they weren't wrong. He'd driven competitors into bankruptcy, manipulated cattle prices to his advantage, and used his wealth to influence local politics when it suited his purposes. But what they didn't understand was that his ruthlessness was armor against the pain that still woke him some nights, reaching for a wife who'd been dead for 20 years. Now, as snow began to fall outside his study windows, Silas wondered if this was all there would ever be. More land, more cattle, more empty rooms in an empty house. The deed in his hands represented everything he'd achieved, but also everything he'd lost in the achieving. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the east, Emma Price was packing her few belongings into a worn leather satchel that had once belonged to her father. At 26, she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite circumstances that would have broken many women. Her condition was obvious now, 6 months along with child, but her spine remained straight and her chin held high. Emma's story was one of education and heartbreak, of dreams deferred and courage tested. Born in Boston to a physician father and a mother who died when Emma was 12, she'd been raised on books and learning. Her father had been progressive for his time, insisting that his daughter receive the same classical education as any son. Emma had excelled, devouring literature and history, mathematics and natural sciences. She'd planned to become a teacher, perhaps even attend one of the new women's colleges. But her father's death from consumption, when she was 22, had left her with little money and fewer options. Teaching positions in Boston were scarce, and the few available were reserved for women of impeccable reputation and family connections. That's when Thomas Whitmore had entered her life. Handsome, charming, and claiming to be a successful businessman, he'd courted her with flowers and promises. He spoke of his business interests in the West, painted pictures of a life of comfort and respectability as his wife. Emma, grieving and alone, had allowed herself to believe in his vision of their future together. The truth had come crashing down 6 months later. Thomas was married, had been married for 8 years, to a woman in Philadelphia. His business interests were largely fictional. His charm, a facade hiding a man who collected lonely women like some men collected stamps. By the time Emma discovered the truth, she was carrying his child. Thomas had offered her money to handle the situation, as he'd put it with casual cruelty. When she'd refused, he'd disappeared entirely, leaving her to face the consequences alone. In Boston society, an unmarried woman with child was ruined beyond redemption. The teaching positions she'd hoped for became impossible dreams. But Emma Price had inherited more than her father's medical bag and his love of learning. She'd inherited his backbone. Rather than accept charity or shame, she'd answered an advertisement for a schoolteacher in the Wyoming territory. Mercy Ridge was a small settlement in need of someone to educate their children, and they were desperate enough to overlook questions about her marital status if she could prove her qualifications. The letters she'd exchanged with the town council had been encouraging. They needed someone with real education, someone who could teach more than basic reading and arithmetic. Emma could offer Latin and mathematics, history and natural sciences. She could help their children reach for something beyond the harsh realities of frontier life. The journey west had been an ordeal of trains and stagecoaches, of suspicious looks and whispered comments. But Emma had endured it all with quiet grace, her father's medical bag clutched in her hands, her dreams of a schoolhouse, and eager students keeping her strong. Now, as she prepared for the final leg of her journey to Mercy Ridge, Emma felt the child move within her and whispered a prayer to the wind. She was betting her future and her child's future on the kindness of strangers in a town she'd never seen. It was a leap of faith that would have terrified her 6 months ago. But heartbreak had taught her something valuable. Sometimes the only way forward was to keep moving, even when you couldn't see the destination clearly. The stagecoach that would take her to Mercy Ridge was leaving in 3 days. The driver had warned her about the weather-really December storms could be brutal in the mountains, and travel became treacherous quickly. But Emma couldn't afford to wait for spring. Her savings were nearly gone, and her condition would soon make travel impossible. She'd packed carefully, her father's medical supplies, her few books, the letters from the Mercy Ridge Town Council, and a small wooden box containing her mother's wedding ring and a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. Everything else, her father's furniture, her childhood home, her old life, had been sold to pay for this journey into the unknown. As she closed the satchel and set it beside her narrow bed, Emma caught her reflection in the window glass. The woman looking back at her was older than her 26 years, marked by sorrow but not defeated by it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot, her grey eyes steady and determined. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd lost everything and was determined to build something new from the ashes. Neither Emma nor Silas could have imagined that fate was drawing them toward each other across the vast Wyoming landscape. Neither could have guessed that a winter storm would bring them together in circumstances that would strip away all pretense and reveal the people they truly were beneath their carefully constructed facades. The stage was set for transformation. All that remained was for the Wyoming winter to play its part. The Wyoming Territory in 1887 was a land of contradictions, breathtakingly beautiful and brutally harsh, offering unlimited opportunity alongside the constant threat of death. It was a place where men could reinvent themselves completely, where the past mattered less than the strength of your gun arm and the depth of your determination. But it was also a place that tested every soul who dared to call it home. Cheyenne, the territorial capital, bustled with the energy of a place caught between frontier and civilization. The Union Pacific Railroad had brought merchants and money, gamblers and legitimate businessmen, ladies in fine dresses and women whose occupations were best not discussed in polite company. Cattle barons like Silas Hart built grand houses on the outskirts of town, while cowboys spent their wages on whiskey and women in the saloons along Ferguson Street. But venture beyond Cheyenne's relative sophistication, and Wyoming revealed its true nature. Towns like Mercy Ridge existed by sheer stubborn will, clusters of weathered buildings huddled against the wind like frightened animals. These settlements survived on ranching, mining, or serving as waypoints for travelers, brave enough to cross the vast emptiness between larger towns. The people who chose this life were shaped by it. Men grew hard or broke entirely. Women learned to be strong or didn't survive long enough to learn anything else. Children grew up fast, understanding from an early age that comfort was temporary and death was always riding just over the next hill. Winter was the great equalizer. It didn't matter if you were rich like Silas Hart or struggling like most everyone else. January in Wyoming could kill you just as dead. The storms came without warning, turning familiar landmarks into alien landscapes of white death. Cattle froze, standing up. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite, sometimes their lives to the cold that crept into their bones and wouldn't let go. Smart folks prepared carefully for winter, laying in supplies and checking their shelter. But even the most careful preparation couldn't account for every possibility. Every winter claimed lives, and every spring revealed the bodies of those who'd gambled against the cold and lost. Silas Hart's ranch sat in a broad valley 30 miles north of Cheyenne, protected from the worst winds by ridges of pine-covered hills. The main house was a testament to both his wealth and his lone-line stories of solid timber and stone, with windows that looked out over grazing land that stretched to the horizon. The furnishings were the finest money could buy, shipped by rail from Chicago and Denver. Persian rugs covered polished floors, and oil paintings of pastoral scenes hung on walls that never heard laughter. His foreman, Miguel Santos, had worked for Silas for 15 years and understood his boss better than most. Miguel was a compact man in his 50s, his hair gone gray but his seat in the saddle still sure. He'd been a vaquero in California before drifting north, and he understood cattle and horses with an instinct that couldn't be taught. More importantly, Miguel understood men. He saw the loneliness that ate at Silas Hart like a cancer, saw how his boss pushed everyone away, even as his eyes hungered for human connection. Miguel had tried, over the years, to bridge that gap with gentle conversation and small gestures of friendship. But Silas had built his walls too high and too strong. The other hands respected Silas, but didn't warm to him. They worked hard for their wages and appreciated that he paid fairly and on time, but they saw him as a force of nature rather than a man. When they gathered around the bunkhouse stove on winter evenings, sharing stories and jokes, Silas remained alone in his big house, eating meals prepared by a cook who barely spoke English and slept in the servants' quarters. It was a life that would have suited some men perfectly: wealth, power, respect, born of fear. But for Silas, it had become a slow form of dying. Emma's journey west had given her ample time to observe her fellow travelers and learn about her destination. The stagecoach passengers were a mixed lot, a traveling salesman full of dubious stories, an elderly woman visiting relatives in Denver, and a young man who claimed to be a mining engineer, but whose soft hands suggested he'd never done much actual mining. From them and from conversations at way stations, Emma had pieced together a picture of what awaited her in Mercy Ridge. The town had been founded 5 years earlier, when copper was discovered in the nearby mountains. The mine had produced well for 2 years, drawing families who hoped to build something permanent. But when the copper played out, many had moved on to chase other opportunities. Those who remained were the stubborn ones, the ones who'd put down roots too deep to pull up easily. They ran small ranches and farms, operated a general store and a blacksmith shop, and tried to convince themselves that Mercy Ridge had a future beyond the failed mine. The children needed education, and they'd been fortunate enough to attract a young minister named James Crawford, who'd been teaching basic reading and arithmetic. But Reverend Crawford was being called to a larger congregation in Colorado, leaving the town without anyone qualified to run a proper school. That's where Emma came in. Her letters had impressed the town council with their evidence of real learning. She could teach not just the basics but history and literature, mathematics beyond simple arithmetic, even some natural sciences. For children growing up in isolated Mercy Ridge, she represented a window to the larger world. The town had promised her a small house behind the church, a modest salary paid in installments as the community could afford it, and the respect due a teacher. What they hadn't promised, and what Emma knew better than to ask about, was how they'd react to her unmarried condition once her pregnancy became obvious. She'd hoped to have time to establish herself, to prove her worth as a teacher before her personal situation became impossible to ignore. But the child was growing quickly, and her condition would soon be obvious to anyone with eyes. She could only pray that her skills would outweigh the scandal of her circumstances. The final stagecoach ride to Mercy Ridge was scheduled to take 2 days, with an overnight stop at a way station in the mountains. The driver, a weathered man named Pete Kowalski, had warned all passengers about the weather. Early winter storms in the high country were unpredictable and dangerous. "We get caught in a real blow," he'd said, chewing tobacco and spitting into the dirt. "We hole up wherever we can and wait it out. Ain't no schedule worth dying for." Emma had nodded and assured him she understood, but privately she worried about delays. Her money would only stretch so far, and every day's delay brought her closer to the point where her condition would make employment impossible. As she settled into the stagecoach for what she hoped would be the final leg of her journey, Emma clutched her father's medical bag and offered another prayer to whatever powers might be listening. She was about to enter a new life, carrying new life within her, betting everything on the kindness of strangers in a place she'd never seen. The Wyoming winter was gathering its strength in the mountains ahead, preparing to test both Emma Price and Silas Hart in ways neither could imagine. The storm struck without mercy on Emma's second day of travel toward Mercy Ridge. What had begun as scattered snowflakes at dawn became a howling wall of white by noon, forcing Pete Kowalski to abandon any hope of reaching the way station before dark. "We're gonna have to find shelter," he shouted over the wind, his words barely audible above the storm's roar. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles off the main trail. Ain't much, but it's got a roof." Emma clutched her father's medical bag tighter as the stagecoach lurched through deepening snow. The other passengers, the traveling salesman and the elderly woman, looked frightened but resigned. They'd known the risks when they'd started this journey. What none of them knew was that Silas Hart was fighting his own battle with the storm just 5 miles away. He'd left his ranch that morning against Miguel's advice, determined to check on a line of fence that marked his southern boundary. Cattle had a way of drifting in storms, and neighbors had an unfortunate tendency to claim strays that wandered onto their land. A few hours' ride in the snow had seemed manageable when he'd saddled his horse at sunrise. But the storm had intensified beyond all prediction. What should have been a routine ride became a fight for survival as wind-driven snow turned the familiar landscape into an alien wilderness. His horse, a reliable sorrel gelding named Buck, struggled through drifts that grew deeper with each passing hour. Silas had turned for home when the visibility dropped to mere yards, but the storm seemed to come from all directions at once, disorienting him completely. The fever had started as a dull ache behind his eyes, so subtle he'd barely noticed it. By the time he recognized the danger, his body was burning despite the cold, and his thoughts had begun to blur like the landscape around him. Influenza could kill a healthy man in days, and Silas was alone in a blizzard with his body betraying him mile by mile. Buck stumbled in a hidden gully, throwing his rider hard into a snowbank before struggling back to his feet and disappearing into the white void, seeking shelter with the animal instinct that humans often lacked. Silas lay where he'd fallen, snow already beginning to cover his dark coat. The fever painted strange colors behind his closed eyelids, while the cold crept through his clothes like fingers of ice. He'd built an empire worth more than most men could imagine, but wealth meant nothing to the storm. The Wyoming winter would claim him as easily as it claimed any other man foolish enough to challenge it alone. That's when Emma found him. She'd insisted on walking despite her condition, unable to bear the stagecoach's violent lurching any longer. Pete had reluctantly agreed, knowing the line shack was less than a mile away, and the pregnant woman seemed steadier on her feet than in the coach. The other passengers had opted to stay with the relative warmth of the enclosed vehicle. Emma pulled her wool cloak tighter and followed Pete's footsteps through the snow, her father's medical bag clutched in one mittened hand. Each step was an effort. The snow was knee-deep in places, and her pregnancy made balance treacherous. But the movement warmed her, and the fresh air, despite its bite, was preferable to the stagecoach's stifling atmosphere. She almost walked past the dark shape half buried in the snow. Only a glimpse of fabric that seemed too regular, too purposeful for the natural landscape, made her stop and look closer. "Pete!" she called, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Pete, there's someone here." The driver fought his way back through the snow, cursing colorfully when he saw what Emma had discovered. A man lay unconscious in the snowbank, his face flushed with fever despite the cold. He was well-dressed, his coat was fine wool, his boots expensive leather butt that wouldn't matter if they left him to freeze. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Pete muttered, kneeling beside the still form. "That's Silas Hart, richest man in 3 counties, and he's gonna die out here like any other fool." Emma was already opening her medical bag, her father's training overriding any other consideration. She'd seen fever before consumption had taken her father slowly, but she'd nursed him through countless episodes of burning sickness. This man's face showed the telltale flush of high fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. "We have to get him to shelter," she said, checking his pulse with fingers that knew what they were doing. "He's burning up. In this cold, that fever could kill him as surely as freezing." Pete looked doubtful. "Mum, that's Silas Hart. He ain't exactly known for his kindness to strangers. Might be better to what?" Emma's voice carried an edge of steel that surprised them both. "Leave him to die because he's unkind. Help me get him up, Pete. No one deserves to die alone in the snow." The driver hesitated for a moment longer, then sighed and began helping Emma lift the unconscious man. Silas was tall and solid, dead weight in their arms, but Emma's determination seemed to give her strength beyond her slight frame. They half-carried, half-dragged him through the snow toward the line shack, Emma's cloak billowing around them like dark wings. The small cabin appeared through the storm like a mirage-weathered wood and a stone chimney, barely larger than a single room but promising shelter from the killing wind. Pete kicked open the door and they stumbled inside, laying Silas on the single rough cot that served as the shack's only furniture. Emma immediately began checking his condition more thoroughly, her movements sure and professional despite the cabin's dim light. "His fever's dangerously high," she said, loosening his collar and feeling for his pulse again. "We need to get a fire started and try to break this fever before it kills him." Pete nodded and began gathering kindling from the small pile beside the stone fireplace. The line shack was basic but functional, built to shelter cowboys during roundups or bad weather. There was firewood, a few basic supplies, and most importantly, 4 walls and a roof to hold back the storm. As Pete coaxed flames from the dry kindling, Emma retrieved supplies from her medical bag. Her father had taught her that fever was both enemy and ally, the body's way of fighting infection, but dangerous when it climbed too high. She had willow bark for pain and fever, herbs for strengthening the heart, and most importantly, the knowledge of how to use them. The fire caught and began to warm the small space, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Emma soaked a cloth in snow water and began bathing Silas's face, trying to bring down his temperature. His skin was hot enough to dry the cloth almost instantly. "You sure you know what you're doing, ma'am?" Pete asked, genuinely worried. "If Silas Hart dies in here with us, there's going to be questions asked." Emma looked up from her patient, her grey eyes steady in the firelight. "My father was a physician, Pete. I've been caring for sick people since I was 12 years old. This man has influenza, and he'll die without proper care. I'm not going to let that happen." She turned back to Silas, checking his breathing and pulse again. His fever was holding steady but hadn't broken yet. She mixed willow bark tea over the fire, the bitter smell filling the small cabin. "Besides," she added softly, "I've seen what happens when people turn away from those who need help. I won't be that kind of person." Pete settled back against the wall, recognizing that the young woman had made her decision and wouldn't be swayed. He'd seen enough of the world to know that some people had steel in their spines that couldn't be bent. Emma Price was clearly one of them. Outside, the storm howled with renewed fury, as if angry that 3 souls had found shelter from its wrath. Snow piled against the cabin's walls while wind rattled the roof and made the fire dance in the stone hearth. Emma worked through the afternoon, bathing Silas's fever and forcing small amounts of medicinal tea between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. She spoke to him softly, the way her father had spoken to his patients, with gentle authority and calm reassurance. As darkness fell and the storm showed no signs of abating, Emma realized they might be trapped together for days. She looked down at the unconscious man whose life she'd chosen to save, this stranger whose reputation for ruthlessness meant nothing in the face of human suffering. She had no way of knowing that her simple act of compassion would change both their lives forever. Silas Hart awakened to the sound of gentle humming and the scent of something medicinal brewing over a fire. For a moment, confusion clouded his thoughts. This wasn't his bedroom, wasn't his house, wasn't anywhere he recognized. The walls were rough logs chinked with mud, the ceiling low and blackened with smoke from countless fires. Then memory crashed back like a physical blow. The storm, the fever, Buck throwing him into the snow. He should be dead, frozen solid in some nameless drawer. Instead, he was alive, weak but alive, lying on a rough cot in what appeared to be a line shack. "You're awake." The voice was soft, cultured, unmistakably feminine. He turned his head, movement sending waves of dizziness through his skull, and saw her clearly for the first time. She sat beside a small fire, stirring something in a battered tin cup. Even in the dim light, he could see she was beautiful, not in the painted, artificial way of the women he occasionally visited in Cheyenne, but with a natural grace that belonged more in a drawing room than a frontier cabin. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, her grey eyes intelligent and watchful, and she was pregnant. Very obviously, unmistakably pregnant. "Who are you?" His voice came out as a croak, barely recognizable as his own. "Emma Price," she replied, setting down the cup and rising to check his forehead with a cool hand. Her touch was gentle but professional, the way a doctor might examine a patient. "And you're Silas Hart, according to the stagecoach driver who helped me get you here." Silas tried to sit up, then thought better of it as the room spun around him. "How long have I been what happened to my horse?" 3 days. Emma said simply, "Your horse was gone when we found you. You've been burning with fever, delirious most of the time. I wasn't sure you'd make it through the first night. 3 days. The implications hit him like hammer blows. His men would be looking for him, worried sick. Miguel would have organized search parties, but in a storm like this, they'd never find the line shack. And this woman, this pregnant stranger, had been caring for him, alone. "You should have left me," he said, studying her face in the firelight. "Do you know who I am? What people say about me?" Emma moved to the fire and ladled some of her medicinal tea into the cup. "I know you're a man who was dying of fever in a snowbank." That's all that mattered. She brought the cup to him, supporting his head as he drank. The tea was bitter but warming, and he could feel strength beginning to seep back into his limbs. "People say I'm ruthless," Silas continued, watching her face for any sign of fear or recognition. "They say I've ruined smaller ranches, driven families off their land." "Are they right?" Emma asked simply, settling back into her chair. The directness of the question caught him off guard. Most people either feared him or tried to curry favor with him. No one simply asked if the stories were true. Some of them, he admitted, "Business is business. The weak don't survive out here." "And yet here you are, alive because a pregnant woman chose to help a stranger," Emma observed. "Perhaps survival isn't just about being strong." Silas studied her face, trying to understand this woman who spoke like an educated lady but found herself alone and pregnant in a frontier cabin. "What's your story, Miss Price? What brings a woman like you to Wyoming territory?" Emma's hand moved unconsciously to her swollen belly. "I'm going to teach school in Mercy Ridge. The town council hired me to educate their children." "Mercy Ridge?" Silas frowned. "That's barely a town. Mining played out 2 years ago. Why would you go to a place like that?" "Because they need a teacher, and I need work," Emma replied with simple honesty. "Sometimes our choices are limited by our circumstances." There was pain in her voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Silas found himself curious about those circumstances in a way that surprised him. When had he last cared about another person's troubles? "The father of your child?" he asked, then immediately regretted the intrusion. "Forgive me, that's not my business." "No, it's not," Emma agreed, but without anger. "But since we're sharing uncomfortable truths, he's not in the picture. I'm on my own." The words hung in the air between them. Silas understood abandonment, not in the same way, perhaps, but he knew what it felt like to be alone in the world. His isolation was self-imposed, built from years of choosing money and power over human connection. Hers seemed to have been forced upon her. "That must be frightening," he said quietly, "facing motherhood alone." Emma looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such understanding from the notorious Silas Hart. "Terrifying," she admitted. "But what's the alternative? Despair? I refuse to give up before my child even has a chance at life." Her courage impressed him. Here was a woman facing social disgrace and an uncertain future, yet she spoke with quiet determination rather than self-pity. When had he last met someone with such backbone? Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin walls. Snow had drifted against the single window, and wind howled down the chimney, making the fire dance and flicker. They were completely cut off from the world, two strangers sharing warmth and shelter while the Wyoming winter raged around them. "Tell me about Mercy Ridge," Silas said, partly to keep the conversation going and partly because he was genuinely curious. "What do you know about the place you're going?" Emma pulled a worn letter from her pocket. "Not much beyond what the town council told me. About 60 families, mostly small ranchers and farmers now that the mine's closed. They want their children to have real education mathematics beyond basic arithmetic, history, literature. They're willing to pay what they can afford." Silas knew Mercy Ridge by reputation. It was the kind of hard-scrabble settlement that dotted the territory places that existed on hope and stubbornness, always one bad winter or failed crop away from becoming ghost towns. The people there would be suspicious of outsiders, conservative in their thinking, and unforgiving of moral lapses. "They know about your condition?" he asked gently. Emma's hand moved to her belly again. "Not yet. I was hoping to establish myself first, prove my worth as a teacher before." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Before they discover their respectable schoolmarm is an unwed mother. Silas finished. Emma, those people won't care how well you teach once they find out. Frontier communities can be harsh judges. Then I'll face that when it comes, Emma replied, with more confidence than she felt. I won't apologize for choosing life over shame. Her words stirred something in Silas that had been dormant for years. When had he last met someone who faced adversity with such grace? His wife Sarah had possessed similar courage, but that was 20 years and a lifetime ago. As if reading his thoughts, Emma asked, "Have you ever been married, Mr. Hart?" The question caught him unprepared. He rarely spoke of Sarah, had trained himself not to think of her, except in the darkest hours of sleepless nights. "Once," he said simply. "She died in childbirth, 20 years ago." "I'm sorry," Emma said, and he could hear genuine sympathy in her voice. "That must have been devastating." "It was," Silas admitted. I've kept to myself since then." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside. Both were lost in their own thoughts, processing the strange intimacy that circumstances had forced upon them. Finally, Emma rose to check the food she'd been preparing. Pete had left them with basic supplies before returning to his stagecoach and other passengers, promising to send help when the storm broke. Emma had rationed carefully, but they had enough to last several more days if necessary. "You should try to eat something," she said, offering him a bowl of simple stew made from dried beef and vegetables. "You need to rebuild your strength." As Silas accepted the bowl, their fingers brushed, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, a spark of genuine human connection. This woman had saved his life, cared for him through fever and delirium, asked nothing in return. She was everything he'd forgotten existed in the world, kind, brave, principled. And she was beautiful, carrying herself with dignity despite circumstances that would have broken many women. As he watched her move around the small cabin, tending the fire and organizing their meager supplies, Silas found himself wondering what it would be like to have such a woman in his life permanently. The thought surprised and frightened him in equal measure. By the fourth day, Silas was strong enough to sit up without dizziness, and the fever had broken completely. Emma had proven herself a skilled nurse, monitoring his condition with the expertise her father had taught her. But more than that, she'd revealed herself to be intelligent, thoughtful, and surprisingly well-educated for a frontier schoolteacher. "You studied at a women's college?" Silas asked as Emma read aloud from a book of poetry she'd carried in her traveling bag. Her voice was cultured, her pronunciation perfect, her understanding of the verses sophisticated. "No, though I wanted to," Emma replied, closing the book and setting it aside. "My father believed in education for women. He taught me alongside my regular governess lessons, Latin, mathematics, natural sciences. I read everything in his library." "Your father was a physician?" "In Boston. He specialized in diseases of the lungs." Emma's voice grew soft with memory. "He died of consumption when I was 22. Ironic, considering how many lung patients he'd saved over the years." Silas heard the love and loss in her voice, recognized the pain of someone who'd watched a parent die slowly. "That's how you learn to care for the sick." "He included me in his practice from the time I was 12. Emma nodded, said medicine was too important to be limited by convention. "I assisted with surgeries, mixed medications, helped deliver babies. The other physicians disapproved, but patients didn't care about my gender when I could ease their pain." The more Silas learned about Emma Price, the more remarkable she seemed. Here was a woman with genuine medical training, classical education, and the courage to travel alone across the continent to start a new life. Yet circumstances had forced her into the precarious position of unwed motherhood. "The father of your child," Silas said carefully. "He was someone who took advantage of your situation after your father's death." Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was steady but sad. "Thomas Whitmore presented himself as a successful businessman. Charming, well-dressed, seemingly respectable. He courted me properly, spoke of marriage and building a life together in the West. She paused, her hand moving to her teaching slate, which she'd been using to sketch lessons for her future students. The worn piece of wood and metal represented her dreams, her determination to build something meaningful from the wreckage of her old life. I discovered he was already married when his wife appeared at my boarding house looking for him. Emma continued. By then, I was carrying his child. He offered me money to handle the situation, as he put it. When I refused, he disappeared. The casual cruelty of it angered Silas in a way that surprised him. He'd seen plenty of men abandon their responsibilities over the years, but something about Emma's situation, her dignity in the face of betrayal, her determination to protect her unborn child stirred protective instincts he'd thought long dead. You could have stayed in Boston, found some other solution, he said. You mean give up my child or hide in shame? Emma's grey eyes flashed. No, this baby is innocent of its father's sins, and I refuse to spend my life apologizing for choosing love over caution, even if that love was misplaced. Her fierce protectiveness reminded Silas of Sarah, who'd also possessed that rare combination of gentleness and steel. But where Sarah had been taken by the harsh realities of frontier life, Emma seemed determined to meet those realities head-on and bend them to her will. Tell me about your ranch, Emma said, clearly wanting to change the subject. How did you build such a large operation? Silas found himself describing his early years in Wyoming. The back-breaking work of building a herd from nothing, the business decisions that had gradually expanded his holdings. But as he talked, he began to see his success through Emma's eyes, the human cost of his ruthless efficiency, the families displaced by his expansion. You sound almost ashamed of it, Emma observed when he finished. Not ashamed, Silas replied slowly, but sitting here, talking to you, I wonder if I lost something important in the building. I have more money than I can spend, more land than I can ride across in a day, but I eat my meals alone and sleep in an empty house. Success without connection is just elaborate loneliness, Emma said softly. My father used to say that. He built a successful practice, but he never forgot that medicine was about healing people, not just accumulating wealth. They talked through the afternoon as snow continued to fall outside. Emma shared stories from her father's practice, tales of difficult births and miraculous recoveries, of wealthy patients who demanded special treatment and poor families who paid with chickens and vegetables. Silas found himself telling her about his early struggles, the mistakes that had taught him hard lessons, the gradual isolation that had become his normal way of life. You could change that, Emma said as they shared their simple evening meal. Wealth gives you freedom to choose differently. At 42, I've been alone so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be otherwise. Emma smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. People change when they have reason to change. Look at me 6 months ago. I was a proper Boston spinster caring for her dying father. Now I'm a pregnant frontier schoolmarm cooking stew in a line shack. The intimacy of their situation was beginning to affect them both. 4 days in close quarters, sharing meals and conversation, had created a bond that transcended their different backgrounds. Silas found himself watching Emma's graceful movements, the way firelight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, the gentle curve of her body that spoke of new life growing within. For her part, Emma was discovering that the notorious Silas Hart was far more complex than his reputation suggested. Yes, he was hard and sometimes ruthless, but she glimpsed the lonely man beneath the cattle-barren facade. He was intelligent, well-read despite his lack of formal education, and capable of surprising gentleness. Emma, Silas said suddenly, then stopped, unsure how to voice what he was thinking. Yes? When we get out of here, when you reach Mercy Ridge, he struggled for words. I have influence in this territory. Money opens doors. If you need anything, any help at all. Emma studied his face in the firelight, seeing the sincerity there. That's kind of you, Silas, but I need to do this myself. If I'm to earn respect as a teacher, it has to be on my own merits. even if the town turns against you when they discover your condition. Especially then, Emma replied firmly. I won't be kept by anyone, no matter how generous their intentions. I've seen what happens to women who accept that kind of arrangement. Her independence frustrated and impressed him in equal measure. Part of him wanted to solve her problems with his wealth and influence. But he was beginning to understand that Emma Price wouldn't be rescued. She would rescue herself, or not at all. You're a remarkable woman, he said quietly. I'm a woman doing what needs to be done, Emma replied. Nothing more, nothing less. But as their eyes met across the small space, both felt the spark of something deeper than gratitude or sympathy. The storm had thrown them together by chance, but the connection growing between them was entirely their own making. Outside, the wind began to subside for the first time in 4 days. The worst of the storm was passing, which meant their time in the isolated cabin was drawing to a close. Soon, they would return to the world, he to his vast ranch and empty house, she to an uncertain future in Mercy Ridge. Neither wanted to think about that parting, so they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low and listening to the gradually quieting wind. In the morning, they would have to face reality again. But for now, they had warmth and shelter and the unexpected gift of human connection in the midst of wilderness. It was more than either had dared hope for when the storm began. The morning brought clear skies and the sound of approaching horses. Silas recognized Miguel's voice calling his name even before his foreman appeared in the cabin doorway, relief and worry warring on his weathered face. Dios mío, boss, Miguel breathed, taking in the scene's employer sitting up on the rough cot, a pregnant woman tending a fire, the obvious signs of several days' habitation. We've been searching since the storm started. Half the territory's been looking for you. Emma rose gracefully, gathering her few belongings with quiet efficiency. The magical isolation of the past 4 days was ending, and with it, the strange intimacy that had developed between her and Silas. This is Miss Emma Price, Silas said, his voice carrying an authority that made Miguel straighten unconsciously. She saved my life, Miguel, found me dying of fever in the snow and nursed me back to health. Miguel removed his hat respectfully, his dark eyes taking in Emma's obvious education and condition with the quick assessment of a man who'd learned to read people for survival. Señorita, we are in your debt. The patron is important to many people. I did what anyone would do, Emma replied simply, though both men knew that wasn't true. Many people would have left Silas Hart to die in the snow without a second thought. As Miguel helped Silas to his feet, testing his strength, Emma stepped outside to give them privacy. The world beyond the cabin was transformed snow, lay deep and pristine under brilliant sunshine, the storm's fury replaced by crystalline beauty. But the beauty couldn't mask the reality that their time together was ending. Silas joined her outside, moving carefully but under his own power. His recovery was remarkable, testament to both his constitution and Emma's skilled care. Miguel brought my carriage, he said, nodding toward the sturdy vehicle his foreman had somehow managed to get through the snow. I can take you to Mercy Ridge. It's not far out of our way. Emma hesitated. Arriving in town with Silas Hart would create exactly the kind of speculation she hoped to avoid. But the alternative was waiting for Pete's stagecoach to return, and she was already days behind schedule. Thank you, she said finally, but perhaps you could drop me at the edge of town. I'd prefer to arrive quietly. Silas understood immediately. Her reputation was precarious enough without being seen in the company of a notorious cattle baron. The thought saddened him more than it should have. The ride to Mercy Ridge took 2 hours over roads that were barely passable. Emma sat wrapped in warm blankets, watching the Wyoming landscape roll past endless white expanses, broken by dark lines of pine and the occasional ranch building. It was beautiful in its vastness, but she could see why it might drive a person to either greatness or madness. Silas had been quiet during the journey, lost in thoughts he couldn't share. He'd carved something during their last morning in the cabina, small wooden horse, roughly made but recognizable. He'd presented it to Emma without explanation, saying only that every child should have a toy. Now, as Mercy Ridge appeared ahead of them, Emma pulled the little horse from her bag and turned it over in her hands. The wood was smooth, shaped with obvious care, despite Silas's claim that he had no skill at carving. It was a gift from a man who'd built walls around his heart so high that simple kindness seemed foreign to him. "There," Silas said, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley between low hills. Mercy Ridge. The town was smaller than Emma had expected, perhaps 20 buildings total, including houses, businesses, and a white-painted church with a modest steeple. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily business, tiny figures against the snow. "It's lovely," Emma said, though she could see the signs of a community struggling to survive. Several buildings stood empty, their windows dark. The main street was rutted and muddy, where snow had been trampled by horses and wagon wheels. Silas called for Miguel to stop the carriage at the top of the hill overlooking the town. Emma gathered her belongings, her father's medical bag, and the few possessions that represented her entire life. "Emma," Silas began, then stopped, searching for words that wouldn't come. "How did you thank someone for saving your life? How did you say goodbye to someone who'd shown you possibilities you'd forgotten existed?" "I know," Emma said softly, understanding his struggle. "These past few days they've been extraordinary, but we both have lives to return to. If you need anything—" "I'll manage," Emma said firmly, though her voice was gentle. "But thank you, Silas, for everything." She climbed down from the carriage with Miguel's assistance, shouldering her bag and straightening her spine. Silas watched her walk away, noting the determined set of her shoulders, the graceful way she moved, despite her advanced pregnancy. She didn't look back. "Interesting woman," Miguel observed quietly, as Emma's figure grew smaller on the snowy road. "Yes," Silas replied, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. "She is." Emma's arrival in Mercy Ridge created exactly the stir she'd hoped to avoid. By the time she reached the main street, word had spread that the new schoolteacher had arrived. People emerged from buildings to stare some curious, some welcoming, others obviously shocked by her obvious pregnancy. The first person to approach her was a tall, thin man in his 50s, wearing a clerical collar. His face was kind but concerned as he hurried down the church steps. "Miss Price, I presume. I'm Reverend James Crawford. We've been expecting you, though we were concerned when the stage didn't arrive on schedule." "The storm delayed us," Emma replied simply. "I'm sorry to be late." Reverend Crawford's eyes took in her condition with the quick assessment of a man who'd ministered to frontier communities for decades. Emma saw the moment when Christian charity warred with social convention on his weathered face. "Of course, the storm," he said finally. "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. The town council is eager to meet you, and we've prepared the teacher's cottage behind the church." As they walked toward the small house that would be her home, Emma was aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways. The frontier telegraph system was already at work by evening. Everyone in Mercy Ridge would know that their new schoolteacher was an unmarried, pregnant woman. The cottage was tiny but clean, with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of simple furniture, and windows that looked out over the mountains. It would do nicely as a home for her and her child. "The school meets in the church for now," Reverend Crawford explained as he showed her around. "We're hoping to build a proper schoolhouse eventually, but funds are limited." Emma nodded, understanding the economic realities of a struggling frontier town. "I'm sure we'll make do. When do you expect me to begin teaching?" "Monday, if you're feeling up to it. There are 14 children of school age, ranging from 6 to 16. Most can read basic words, but their mathematics and other subjects are quite limited." After Reverend Crawford left, Emma unpacked her few belongings and tried to prepare herself for the challenges ahead. She could feel the town's eyes upon her, could sense the whispered conversations that would shape her reception here. But as she placed Silas's carved horse on the small table beside her bed, Emma felt a surge of determination. She'd saved a man's life and discovered her own strength in the process. Whatever Mercy Ridge threw at her, she would face it with the same courage that had seen her through 4 days in a storm-bound cabin. Outside her window, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, indifferent to human struggles. But Emma Price had learned something important in that line. Sometimes the most meaningful connections came from the most unexpected circumstances. And sometimes, saving someone else's life meant discovering how to save your own. Emma's first week teaching in Mercy Ridge proved both rewarding and challenging. The children were eager to learn, their minds hungry for knowledge beyond the basics they'd received from Reverend Crawford. But their parents presented a more complex problem. The town council meeting on her 3rd evening was civil but tense. Emma sat in the front pew of the church, while 5 men, the closest thing Mercy Ridge had to local government, discussed her situation in careful, measured tones. "Miss Price is clearly qualified," said Albert Hoffman, who ran the general store. "The children have learned more in 3 days than in the previous 3 months. "That's not the issue," countered Marcus Webb, whose sheep ranch bordered the town. "It's her condition. What kind of example does that set for our young people?" Emma kept her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm despite the anger building in her chest. These men were discussing her, as if she weren't present, as if her pregnancy erased her humanity and reduced her to a moral problem to be solved. "Perhaps we should hear from Miss Price herself," suggested Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town's elderly physician. He was a kind man who'd examined Emma upon her arrival and declared both her and her baby healthy. "Gentlemen," Emma said, rising gracefully despite her bulk, "I understand your concerns, but I would ask you to judge me by my work, not my circumstances. Your children are learning Latin and advanced mathematics. They're reading literature and studying natural sciences. Can you say that about any other teacher available to you?" The church's broken bell caught her eye as she spoke a large bronze casting that had cracked during installation and now sat silent in the corner. Like the town itself, it represented good intentions damaged by harsh realities. "Miss Price," Webb said stiffly, "we're not questioning your abilities, but propriety matters in a community like ours. What you've done—" "What I've done," Emma interrupted, her voice carrying steel beneath its cultured tones, "is survive betrayal with my dignity intact. I've chosen life over shame, responsibility over despair. If that offends your sense of propriety, perhaps your priorities need examination." The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "I propose we focus on results," he said. "Miss Price teaches for 1 month. If the children show marked improvement, we continue the arrangement. If not, we reconsider." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered Emma a chance to prove herself. The vote was 3-2 in favor, with Webb and another rancher dissenting. As the meeting dispersed, Emma felt both relieved and burdened. A month wasn't long to change minds that were already made up. Meanwhile, 30 miles away at the Hart Ranch, Silas was discovering that returning to his old life wasn't as simple as he'd expected. The big house felt emptier than ever, his solitary meals more depressing, his evening routine of reviewing ledgers and correspondence mind-numbingly dull. Miguel noticed the change immediately. His boss was distracted, often staring out windows toward the mountains where Mercy Ridge lay hidden. The hard edge that had defined Silas Hart for 20 years seemed softer somehow, as if something fundamental had shifted during those days in the storm. "Patron," Miguel said carefully one evening as they reviewed the winter feeding schedule, "perhaps you should visit the town, check on the woman who saved your life." Silas looked up sharply. "Miss Price made it clear she wants to handle things herself." "See, but a man can check on a friend, no? Maybe see if the school needs anything. You have influence, money. Such things can help a teacher." Miguel's suggestion planted a seed that grew over the following days. Silas found himself thinking about Emma constantly, how she was managing in Mercy Ridge, whether the townspeople were treating her well, if she needed anything for the school or her coming child. His decision was made when Pete Kowalski stopped by the ranch with disturbing news. The stagecoach driver had been drinking in Cheyenne's saloons, and the talk was all about Mercy Ridge and their scandalous schoolteacher. Some of them church ladies from Laramie are planning to visit, Pete reported. Gonna see for themselves what kind of woman Mercy Ridge hired. Figured you might want to know, seeing as how she saved your life and all. Silas was saddling his horse before Pete finished speaking. The ride to Mercy Ridge gave him time to think about what he was doing and why. He told himself it was simple, gratitude ensuring that the woman who'd saved his life wasn't being mistreated. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Emma Price had awakened something in him that he'd thought permanently buried. In 4 days, she'd shown him possibilities. He'd forgotten existed companionship, understanding, the simple pleasure of sharing thoughts with someone who truly listened. He arrived in Mercy Ridge on a Saturday afternoon to find the town buzzing with unusual activity. A fancy carriage sat outside the church, and well-dressed women moved about with the purposeful air of moral crusaders on a mission. Emma was in her cottage, grading papers at the small table that served as her desk, when she heard the commotion outside. Through her window, she could see the delegation from Laramie's Methodist Ladies' Auxiliary examining her home and workplace with the thoroughness of tax assessors. Mrs. Prudence Blackwood, the auxiliary's president, was a formidable woman in her 60s who'd made moral improvement her life's work. She surveyed Emma's cottage with the expression of someone who'd found exactly what she'd expected to find evidence of degraded living. Reverend Crawford, Miss Blackwood announced in a voice that carried across the churchyard, "This situation cannot be allowed to continue. A woman of loose morals has no business teaching children." Emma rose from her table, straightening her spine and preparing to face whatever came next. She'd known this confrontation was inevitable. Small communities couldn't keep secrets, and news of Mercy Ridge's pregnant schoolteacher had obviously spread. That's when she saw Silas Hart riding down the main street on his big sorrel horse, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone present. He dismounted near the church and walked toward the gathering crowd with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his opinions respected. "Ladies," he said, touching his hat brim politely. "Gentlemen, I heard there was some discussion about Mercy Ridge's new teacher." Mrs. Blackwood turned to face him, clearly recognizing his importance, if not his identity. "And you are?" "Silas Hart. I own the largest ranch in this part of the territory." His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel. "I'm also someone who owes Miss Price his life." A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone knew the name Silas Hart, and his unexpected appearance added a new dimension to the situation. "Mr. Hart," Mrs. Blackwood said carefully, "while we appreciate your gratitude, moral standards must be maintained. This woman's condition makes her unsuitable." "This woman," Silas interrupted, his voice carrying clearly across the churchyard, "is one of the finest people I've ever met. She's educated, skilled in medicine, and possesses more courage than most men I know. Any community would be fortunate to have her." Emma watched from her window, stunned by his unexpected defense. She'd told him she wanted to handle things herself, but hearing his public support sent warmth flooding through her chest. "Her personal circumstances," Silas continued, "are her own business, but her professional qualifications are outstanding, and this town needs what she can offer." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, emboldened by Silas's presence. "The children have shown remarkable improvement in just 1 week. Miss Price is teaching subjects we couldn't even attempt before." "Academic achievement is important," Mrs. Blackwood conceded, "but moral example is paramount. What message does it send to employ a woman who was betrayed by a man and chose courage over surrender?" Silas's voice cut across her words like a blade. "I'd say that's exactly the kind of moral example young people need to see." The crowd was listening intently now, caught between the social conventions Mrs. Blackwood represented and the practical reality Silas was presenting. Emma could see the conflict playing out on their faces. "Furthermore," Silas added, reaching into his coat pocket, "I'm prepared to make a substantial donation to build a proper schoolhouse. Mercy Ridge deserves better than holding classes in the church basement." He produced a bank draft, that made several people gasp when they saw the amount. It was enough to build not just a schoolhouse, but to furnish it properly and support the school for years. Mrs. Blackwood's moral certainty wavered in the face of such practical generosity. A new schoolhouse would be a tremendous asset to the community, but accepting it meant accepting Emma as teacher. The money comes with conditions, Silas continued. Miss Price remains as teacher for as long as she chooses. The school operates under her direction, without interference from outside moral authorities. Emma stepped onto her cottage porch, unable to remain hidden any longer. Her appearance silenced the crowd. She was obviously pregnant, but carried herself with such dignity that even Mrs. Blackwood was momentarily speechless. Mr. Hart, Emma said clearly, while I appreciate your generous offer, I must insist on one modification. The donation should support the school regardless of who teaches here. The children's education is more important than any individual, including myself. Her selfless response surprised everyone present. Here was a woman turning down financial security to ensure the school's future, putting the community's needs above her own protection. Silas smiled at her words, remembering why he'd been so drawn to her character. As you wish, Miss Price. The donation is for the school, with the understanding that Mercy Ridge currently has an exceptional teacher. The crowd began to disperse, the ladies from Laramie clearly frustrated by the turn of events. Mrs. Blackwood made one final attempt to assert moral authority. Mark my words, she declared. No good will come of this arrangement. Moral compromise always leads to social decay. But her words fell on increasingly deaf ears. Money talked loudly in struggling frontier communities, and Silas Hart's support carried weight that even the Methodist Ladies' Auxiliary couldn't match. As the visitors departed and the townspeople returned to their business, Emma and Silas found themselves alone in the churchyard. The broken bell seemed to watch over them like a silent witness to the changes beginning in Mercy Ridge. 3 weeks after Silas's dramatic intervention, Emma was sorting through mail that had arrived on the weekly stage when she discovered an envelope that made her blood run cold. The return address read, Whitmore, Associates, Legal Services, Denver, in elegant script that she recognized all too well. Her hands trembled as she opened the letter, though she tried to tell herself it was probably nothing more than a coincidence. But the signature at the bottom confirmed her worst fears. Thomas Whitmore, Esquire. The letter was written in the formal language of legal documents, but its meaning was devastatingly clear. Thomas had learned of her location and circumstances. He was demanding custody of their unborn child, claiming that an unmarried woman living in a frontier settlement was unfit to raise a child of respectable parentage. But the truly chilling part came in the final paragraph. Thomas had formed a business partnership with certain interests in Wyoming territory who were concerned about undesirable influences in local education. Unless Emma abandoned her position and surrendered custody upon the child's birth, these partners would ensure that Mercy Ridge faced significant economic and legal difficulties. Emma's first instinct was to burn the letter and pretend it had never arrived. But as she read it again, certain phrases began to stand out. References to railroad development opportunities and mineral rights assessments suggested this was about more than just her child or her teaching position. She walked to the church where she'd been conducting afternoon classes and found Reverend Crawford organizing hymnals. The kindly minister had become an ally over the past month, defending her against continued criticism from some community members. Reverend, Emma said carefully, what do you know about railroad plans for this area? Crawford looked up with surprise. Railroad? Why, there's been talk for years about a line through the mountains, but nothing concrete. The terrain is challenging, and the costs would be enormous. But if a railroad did come through, what would that mean for Mercy Ridge? Everything, Crawford said simply. Access to markets, reliable transportation, new businesses. A railroad would transform this entire region. Towns die or thrive based on whether the rails pass through them. Emma felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. She thought about Thomas's letter, about the mysterious partners who were concerned about her influence, about the timing of the ladies' auxiliary visit, and other recent pressures on the community. That evening, she walked to the edge of town where the old mining claims were marked by abandoned equipment and empty shafts. The November air was crisp and clear, offering spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. Standing there in the gathering dusk, she could see how a railroad might route through this valley if certain obstacles were removed. Her cottage sat on land that had been designated for the school by the original town charter. If the school failed and the land became available, it would be perfectly positioned for a railroad depot. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that her arrival in Mercy Ridge had disrupted someone's carefully laid plans. The next morning brought confirmation in the form of a visitor she hadn't expected. A well-dressed man in his 30s dismounted from an expensive horse and approached her cottage with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Miss Price, I'm Jonathan Aldrich, representing certain business interests in Denver. I wonder if we might have a word." Emma invited him inside, though every instinct warned her to be cautious. Aldrich was handsome in a cold way, with calculating eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of Thomas. "I'll be direct, Miss Price," Aldrich said, declining her offer of coffee. "Your presence here has created complications for some important development plans. We're prepared to offer you a generous settlement to relocate to a more suitable position elsewhere." He produced a bank draft that would have represented financial security for years. Emma stared at the amount, then back at his expectant face. "What kind of development plans?" she asked. "Railroad construction, primarily. This valley represents a crucial link in the proposed mountain route, but certain legal requirements must be met regarding community stability and educational facilities." Emma's mind raced as implications became clear. Someone needed Mercy Ridge to fail, needed the school to close, and the community to disperse. Her success as a teacher was interfering with those plans. "You want me to leave so the school will collapse," she said. "I want you to accept a mutually beneficial arrangement," Aldrich corrected smoothly. "You get financial security in a location where your circumstances won't be an issue. Everyone wins, except the children who need education and the families who call this place home." Aldrich's expression hardened slightly. "Miss Price, you're one woman with limited resources facing powerful interests with unlimited patience. This offer represents your best option." After he left, Emma sat staring at the forged land deed he'd accidentally dropped while retrieving his papers. The document appeared to transfer school property rights to a railroad development company, but the signatures were clearly falsified. She recognized the real signature of Albert Hoffman, the storekeeper who served on the town council. This wasn't his handwriting. That evening, she made a decision that would have terrified her 6 months ago. She saddled the horse Reverend Crawford had lent her and rode out to the Hart ranch. Silas was in his study when Miguel announced her arrival. He rose immediately, concern evident on his face as he saw her obvious distress. "Emma, what's wrong?" She handed him Thomas's letter and Aldrich's forged deed, watching his expression darken as he read. When he finished, his jaw was set in the hard lines she remembered from their first meeting. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "I think it started before I even arrived," Emma replied. "They needed the school to fail so they could claim the land. My success as a teacher disrupted their timeline." Silas studied the forged document with the eye of a man who'd seen plenty of fraudulent paperwork over the years. "This is professional work. Whoever's behind this has resources and experience." Thomas mentioned partners in Wyoming territory. "Do you know anything about railroad development plans?" "More than I like," Silas said grimly. "There's been quiet buying of land rights all along the proposed route. Someone's been very careful to stay behind shell companies and legal representatives." He walked to his safe and retrieved a file of documents. "I've been tracking some of these purchases because they affect my grazing rights. Look at this pattern." Emma studied the papers, seeing how various parcels had been systematically acquired around Mercy Ridge. Only the school land remained outside the paterna, crucial piece that would block the entire development. They can't force the town to sell the school property, Emma said. No, but they can make conditions so difficult that the community abandons it voluntarily. Drive away the teacher, make the school fail, then claim the land is unused and available for development. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Her personal tragedy with Thomas had been turned into a weapon against an entire community. The people of Mercy Ridge were pawns in a game they didn't even know was being played. "We have to warn them," Emma said. "With what proof? Forged documents and threatening letters from a man claiming to be your child's father. They'll say you're fabricating stories to justify your position." Silas was right, and they both knew it. Without solid evidence of the larger conspiracy, Emma would look like a desperate woman making up elaborate excuses. "There's something else," Silas said quietly. "I've been asked to sell some of my southern grazing land to railroad interests. The offers have been generous, suspiciously generous." Emma felt the pieces clicking together. "They need your cooperation too. If you refuse to sell, it affects their route. Which means they've been planning this for months, possibly years. Your arrival was just an inconvenient complication." They sat in silence, the weight of discovery settling over them. Emma had thought she was starting over in Mercy Ridge, building a new life through teaching. Instead, she'd walked into the middle of a complex scheme to defraud an entire community. "What do we do?" she asked. Silas looked at her across his desk, seeing the courage that had first attracted him in that storm-bound cabin. Emma Price didn't run from problems, she faced them head-on, even when the odds were overwhelming. "We fight," he said simply, "but we do it smart, and we do it together." Emma felt relief flood through her at his words. She'd been alone for so long, facing each crisis with nothing but her own determination. Having Silas as an ally changed everything. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the first hints of real winter, promising storms that would test everyone's resolve. But inside the warmth of Silas's study, two people who'd found each other by chance were preparing to fight for a community's future. The game was far from over, and Emma Price was about to prove that underestimating a schoolteacher could be a very expensive mistake. Emma's discovery of her father's law books in the cottage's small storage room felt like divine intervention. She'd forgotten packing them, but there they were, 3 volumes of territorial law and legal precedents that Dr. Jonathan Price had studied during his brief consideration of changing careers from medicine to law. "Property rights in territorial settlements," Emma read aloud to Silas the next evening as they planned their strategy. "Community land grants and educational provisions. Silas, listen to this. Land designated for educational purposes under territorial charter cannot be transferred to private interests without unanimous consent of the community and territorial approval." Silas looked up from the railroad documents he'd been analyzing. "That means even if they forge signatures, they can't legally claim the school land without going through proper territorial channels." More importantly, Emma continued, turning pages with growing excitement, "any development that displaces an established educational facility requires compensation to affected families and provision of alternative schooling. They'd have to pay every family in Mercy Ridge and build a new school elsewhere. The legal requirements made the railroad development far more expensive and complicated than the conspirators had planned. No wonder they'd resorted to fraud and intimidation. The legitimate process would cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. Over the following days, Emma and Silas worked to gather evidence while maintaining their normal routines. Emma continued teaching, her students unaware that their classroom might be the center of a territorial-wide conspiracy. Silas managed his ranch operations while quietly investigating the business relationships behind the railroad scheme. Their breakthrough came when Dr. Morrison mentioned an unusual patient he'd treated the previous week, a surveyor who'd been mapping the valley but claimed to be working for the territorial government. When pressed for details, the man had become evasive and left town suddenly. "Railroad surveyors," Silas said grimly. "They're further along with this than we thought." Emma's pregnancy was advancing rapidly, her condition now obvious to everyone, but still not slowing her down. If anything, the approaching birth of her child made her more determined to protect Mercy Ridge. This was where she wanted to raise her baby, among people who'd accepted her despite her circumstances. The town had indeed rallied around their schoolteacher. Her students were excelling beyond anyone's expectations, and even her harshest critics had to admit the quality of education had improved dramatically. Parents who'd been suspicious now brought her fresh bread and offered help with household tasks. But the pressure from outside interests was increasing. More business representatives appeared in town, making generous offers for various properties. Some families were tempted, times were hard, and the money being offered represented financial security they'd never dreamed possible. "They're trying to break us apart gradually," Emma observed during one of her evening strategy sessions with Silas. "Buy out enough families to destabilize the community, then claim the rest should accept reality and take their offers." Silas had his own pressures to deal with. The offers for his southern grazing land had become more insistent, backed by veiled threats about regulatory difficulties that could affect his ranch operations. He was beginning to understand how thoroughly the conspiracy reached into territorial business and politics. "Miguel thinks we should take the money and move the ranch operations north," Silas admitted. "He's worried about what happens if we fight this and lose." "What do you think?" Emma asked. "I think running away from a fight is a luxury I've never been able to afford," Silas replied. "Besides, some things are worth more than money." His eyes met hers as he spoke, and Emma felt the familiar warmth that had been growing between them since their days in the storm cabin. Their relationship had evolved beyond gratitude or even friendship. They were partners now, united by more than just shared danger. Emma's labor pains began during a town council meeting where they'd planned to present their evidence. She'd been explaining the legal protections for educational land when the first contraction hit, so strong it made her gasp and grip the church pew. "Emma?" Silas was at her side immediately, his face concerned. "It's time," she whispered, trying to breathe through the pain. Her baby had chosen the worst possible moment to make its entrance into the world. Dr. Morrison took charge immediately, clearing the church and helping Emma to his clinic above the general store. Silas started to follow, then stopped, torn between his desire to stay with Emma and the need to continue their fight against the conspiracy. "Go," Emma told him as another contraction gripped her. "Finish what we started. This baby deserves to be born into a free community." The next several hours tested everyone's resolve. While Emma labored to bring new life into the world, Silas presented their evidence to the hastily reconvened town council. The forged documents, the pattern of land purchases, the legal requirements that made legitimate development so expensive it all painted a clear picture of conspiracy and fraud. But their opponents weren't giving up easily. As word spread of Emma's labor, Jonathan Aldrich appeared with reinforcements, 3 hard-faced men who looked more like gunfighters than business representatives. "This meeting is illegal," Aldrich announced, striding into the church. "Miss Price is not a legal resident of this territory, having obtained her position through fraudulent means. Any evidence she's presented is inadmissible." "On what grounds?" demanded Albert Hoffman, the storekeeper who'd become one of Emma's staunchest supporters. "She's wanted for theft in Colorado territory," one of Aldrich's men replied, producing official-looking documents. "Stole medical supplies from her former employer. There's a warrant for her arrest." The accusation was obviously fabricated, but it created exactly the confusion and doubt Aldrich needed. Several council members began to waver, unsure whether to trust Emma's evidence or these new allegations. Silas stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Gentlemen, I've known Miss Price for months now. She's a woman of impeccable character who saved my life. These charges are obvious fabrications designed to discredit her testimony." "Your opinion of her character is noted, Mr. Hart," Aldrich replied smoothly, "but the law is the law. She must be taken into custody, pending extradition proceedings." Outside the church, a cry pierced the night air, the unmistakable sound of a newborn baby announcing its arrival. Emma's child had been born in the midst of the crisis that would determine its future. Dr. Morrison appeared in the church doorway, his face flushed with exhaustion but smiling. "It's a girl," he announced. "Mother and baby are both healthy." A cheer went up from the townspeople, momentarily drowning out the legal arguments. In that moment, the abstract concept of protecting the community became intensely personal. They were fighting for the future of a child who'd just drawn her first breath in Mercy Ridge. "Touching," Aldrich said coldly, "but it doesn't change the legal situation. The woman is under arrest, and this meeting is concluded." That's when Reverend Crawford stepped forward, holding a leather-bound book that Emma had asked him to retrieve from her cottage. "Actually," the minister said quietly, "I think you'll find Miss Price's legal status is quite different than you claim." He opened the book to reveal a marriage certificate, properly witnessed and recorded. The document showed that Emma Price had been legally married to Silas Hart 3 days earlier in a quiet ceremony performed by the Reverend himself. The revelation stunned everyone present. Emma was now Mrs. Silas Hart, which gave her unquestionable legal standing in the territory and made any charges against her much more complicated to pursue. "When?" Marcus Webb asked, clearly struggling to understand. "Emma asked me to perform the ceremony when her labor began," Reverend Crawford explained. "She wanted her child to be born legitimate, and Mr. Hart was honored to provide that protection." Silas met the shocked stares with calm dignity. It wasn't the romantic proposal he might have planned, but it was right. Emma and her child deserved his protection and his name, and he was proud to offer both. Aldrich's carefully laid plans were crumbling before his eyes. A married woman with a powerful husband couldn't be easily intimidated or discredited. The legal landscape had shifted dramatically in a single moment. "This changes nothing," he blustered. "The railroad development will proceed with or without this community's cooperation." "Actually," Silas said with a slight smile, "I think you'll find it changes everything. You see, the territorial governor is an old friend of mine. I've sent him a full report of your activities, along with copies of all the forged documents and fraudulent claims." He produced a telegram that had arrived just hours earlier. "He's very interested in meeting with you gentlemen, something about territorial laws regarding conspiracy and fraud." The game was over, and everyone in the church knew it. Aldrich and his men had been outmaneuvered by a pregnant schoolteacher and a cattle rancher who'd learned the value of fighting for something beyond himself. As the conspirators retreated into the night, the people of Mercy Ridge began to realize what they'd accomplished. They'd saved their community, protected their school, and gained a powerful ally in the process. But most importantly, they'd witnessed the birth of new hope literally and figuratively. Emma's daughter would grow up in a free Mercy Ridge, educated in a school that belonged to the community rather than distant railroad interests. The broken church bell might remain silent, but the spirit it represented was stronger than ever. The town meeting resumed with Emma absent, but very much present in everyone's thoughts. Dr. Morrison had reported that mother and baby were resting comfortably, but Emma had insisted the meeting continue without her. "Finish what we started," had been her message, delivered through Reverend Crawford. Silas stood before the assembled townspeople, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. In the space of a few hours, he'd become a husband and father, confronted a conspiracy, and helped save a community. The man who'd lived in isolation for 20 years was now at the center of Mercy Ridge's future. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made life-changing decisions and was at peace with the consequences. "What we've discovered tonight goes beyond threats to our school or our town. This conspiracy reaches into the territorial government itself, and it won't end with our victory here." Albert Hoffman raised his hand. "What do you mean, Mr. Hart?" "I mean, they'll try again, somewhere else, with different methods. Railroad development is coming to Wyoming, that's inevitable. The question is whether it comes through legal channels that benefit communities, or through fraud and intimidation that benefits only the schemers." Silas produced the cornerstone he'd commissioned for the new schoolhouse, a block of local granite with Mercy Ridge School carved into its surface, along with the date and the words knowledge, courage, community. It was meant to be a surprise for Emma, but circumstances had changed everything. "This stone represents our commitment to the future," he continued. "Not just our children's education, but our determination to build something lasting and honest in this territory." Marcus Webb, who'd been one of Emma's harshest critics, stood slowly. "Mr. Hart, I owe you and your wife an apology. I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment about what really matters." Other voices joined in agreement. The crisis had clarified everyone's priorities, showing them what they truly valued. Mrs. Sarah Collins, who ran the boarding house, spoke for many when she said, "That woman, Mrs. Hart, Noah's given more to this community in 2 months than most of us manage in years." But their celebration was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the church windows, they could see torches moving toward the town too, many riders for a peaceful delegation. "Aldrich isn't finished," Silas said grimly, recognizing the tactical approach of men accustomed to violence. "Everyone stay calm, but be ready to defend yourselves." The church doors burst open as a dozen armed men poured inside, led by Jonathan Aldrich and the mysterious third party they'd all been wondering about, Thomas Whitmore himself. Emma's former lover had come to collect what he considered his property. "Gentlemen, ladies," Thomas said with cold politeness, "I'm here on behalf of the Colorado Territorial Court to collect my child and arrest the woman who stole it from me." His appearance shocked everyone except Silas, who'd suspected this moment would come. Thomas was handsome in the way Emma had described, polished, confident, radiating the kind of charm that could convince vulnerable women to trust him. "There's no child here belonging to you," Reverend Crawford said firmly. "Mrs. Hart's daughter was born in lawful wedlock, making her legitimate under territorial law." Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "A marriage of convenience performed while the woman was in labor? Any court will see through that charade. The child is mine by blood, and I have legal standing to claim custody." "You have legal standing to nothing," Silas replied, stepping forward. "You abandoned both mother and child, forfeited any parental rights through your actions." "Did I?" Thomas pulled out another set of documents. "According to these affidavits, I've been searching for my beloved Emma for months, desperate to marry her and legitimize our child. It was only her stubborn pride that prevented our reunion." The forged papers looked official, complete with witness signatures and court seals. Thomas had obviously spent considerable time and money creating a false narrative that painted him as the wronged party seeking to do right by his family. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, "I have evidence that Miss Pricey, or Mrs. Hart, if you prefer the fiction, has been embezzling from the school fund and selling medical supplies illegally. She's wanted for questioning in 3 territories." Each accusation was clearly fabricated, but together they created a web of legal complications that could take months to untangle. In the meantime, Thomas could claim custody of Emma's daughter and disappear back into the vast American frontier. "You're making a mistake," Silas warned, his voice carrying the quiet menace that had made him feared throughout Wyoming territory. "Mrs. Hart is under my protection now, as is her child. Threatening them means threatening me." "And you are?" Thomas asked with mock politeness. "Silas Hart. I own 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Wyoming, employ 24 men who are very loyal to me, and have enough influence in this territory to make life extremely difficult for people who cross me." For the first time, Thomas looked uncertain. He'd obviously researched Emma's situation but hadn't fully understood the power dynamic he was walking into. Silas Hart wasn't just another frontier rancher, he was territorial royalty, with the kind of wealth and connections that could make legal problems disappear or multiply exponentially. "Mr. Hart," Thomas said more carefully, "I'm sure we can reach some accommodation. I'm not unreasonable." "You're not welcome," Silas cut him off. "You had your chance with Emma Price and chose to abandon her. She's Emma Hart now, with all the protection that name carries." That's when one of Thomas's hired guns made a crucial mistake. Seeing the standoff developing, he drew his weapon, apparently thinking intimidation would end the discussion quickly. The move triggered an immediate response from the townspeople. Marcus Webb produced a shotgun from behind the pulpit. Dr. Morrison revealed a Navy Colt tucked into his coat. Even elderly Mrs. Collins brandished a derringer with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "Gentlemen," Reverend Crawford said mildly, though his hand rested on a Winchester rifle, "this is a house of God. I'd prefer not to have bloodshed on consecrated ground, but I'll make exceptions for those who threaten our community." Thomas found himself facing a dozen armed citizens who'd clearly decided that their schoolteacher and her newborn child were worth fighting for. The easy intimidation he'd planned had become a potential massacre, with his men badly outnumbered by people fighting for their homes. "This isn't over," Thomas snarled, signaling his men to lower their weapons. "The territorial court will hear about this obstruction of justice." "I'm sure they will," Silas replied calmly. "Along with evidence of your conspiracy to defraud this community, forge legal documents, and make false claims about parentage. The territorial governor is very interested in your activities, Mr. Whitmore." As Thomas and his men retreated, the people of Mercy Ridge realized something profound had just happened. They'd stood together against outside threats, protected one of their own, and discovered they had more courage than they'd ever imagined. But even as they celebrated this victory, everyone knew the real test would come in the morning, when they'd have to deal with the legal and political consequences of their actions. Emma's labor pains had been intensifying throughout the confrontation in the church, but she'd refused to let Dr. Morrison close his office door. Even as she gripped the bedsheets and fought through each contraction, she could hear the heated voices from below, Silas defending her, the townspeople rallying to protect their school, the sound of weapons being drawn. "Mrs. Hart, Dr." Morrison said gently, trying to keep her focused on the task at hand. "You need to concentrate on bringing this baby safely into the world. Let the men handle the rest." "No," Emma gasped between contractions. "This is my fight too. My daughter's future depends on what happens tonight." When the final contraction came, Emma bore down with all the strength she'd accumulated through months of facing adversity alone. The baby emerged with a lusty cry that seemed to announce her displeasure at being born into such a complicated world. "She's perfect," Dr. Morrison said softly, placing the tiny girl in Emma's arms. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and the loudest voice in Mercy Ridge. Emma looked down at her daughter's wrinkled red face and felt a surge of protective love, so intense it took her breath away. This was what she'd been fighting for, not just her own future, but the chance to give this innocent child a life of dignity and opportunity. "What will you name her?" Dr. Morrison asked as he cleaned up from the delivery. Emma had been considering names for months, but looking at her daughter now, the choice seemed obvious. "Sarah," she said quietly. "Sarah Hart." It was a tribute to the wife Silas had lost 20 years ago, a gesture of respect for the love that had shaped him into the man who'd saved them both. When Silas entered the room moments later, having heard that the baby had arrived safely, Emma saw tears spring to his eyes at her choice. "Sarah," he repeated softly, taking the baby with the careful reverence of a man who'd never expected to hold his own child. "She's beautiful, Emma, just like her mother." The simple wedding ring he slipped onto Emma's finger was his mother's plain gold band he'd saved for 20 years without knowing why. Now, as it settled into place, both of them understood that their marriage had transcended its practical origins to become something real and lasting. "The men outside?" Emma asked, though she could see from Silas's expression that the immediate danger had passed. "Gone for now." Thomas Whitmore showed his true colors, and the whole town saw him for what he is. But Emma, this isn't over. He'll be back with legal papers, territorial marshals, whatever it takes to cause trouble. Emma nodded, having expected this. Thomas had never been the type to accept defeat gracefully, and having his plans exposed would only make him more determined to salvage something from the wreckage. "Then we'll be ready," she said simply. "All of us." The door opened to admit Reverend Crawford, his face beaming despite the evening's tensions. Mrs. Hart, the entire town is waiting to welcome little Sarah. Would you mind if we held an impromptu baptism? Nothing formal, just a blessing for the child and a celebration of new life. Emma looked at Silas, who nodded encouragingly. They wrapped baby Sarah in the soft blanket Mrs. Collins had knitted, and the three of them made their way downstairs to where the entire population of Mercy Ridge waited. The church had been transformed. Someone had lit every candle and lantern available, turning the simple wooden building into a cathedral of warm light. The townspeople stood in respectful silence as Emma and Silas approached the font, their faces reflecting joy and determination in equal measure. "Friends," Reverend Crawford began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed space, "tonight we've witnessed the birth of new hope. This child represents our future, not just her parents' future, but the future of our entire community." As he spoke the words of blessing over baby Sarah, Emma felt the weight of the evening's events settling into perspective. They'd faced down conspiracy and corruption, stood up to intimidation and fraud, and emerged stronger for the struggle. But more than that, they'd discovered what they were truly fighting for. It wasn't just about land rights or school funding or even Emma's reputation. It was about the right of ordinary people to build something good and lasting in a harsh world, to protect the innocent and care for one another despite the differences that might divide them. The blessing concluded with the entire congregation joining hands and singing a hymn of thanksgiving. Emma found herself standing between Silas and Dr. Morrison, holding her sleeping daughter while voices rose around them in harmony that seemed to banish the darkness outside. When the service ended, people began approaching to offer congratulations and small gifts for the baby. Practical Frontier presents a tiny quilt from Mrs. Collins, hand-carved wooden toys from the blacksmith, a silver spoon from Albert Hoffman's store. But the most meaningful gift came from Marcus Webb, Emma's former critic, who'd undergone such a transformation during the crisis. "Mrs. Hart," he said awkwardly, holding a small wooden cross he'd obviously carved himself, "I want to apologize for how I treated you when you first arrived. You've shown all of us what courage really looks like." Emma accepted the cross graciously, understanding how much humility it had taken for the proud rancher to make such a public apology. As the evening wound down and people began heading home, Emma found herself alone with Silas in the church, while baby Sarah slept peacefully in her arms. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we build the life we want," Silas replied. "We raise Sarah together, we fight whatever battles come next, and we prove that love can triumph over scheming and greed." Emma looked around the simple church that had become the center of their community's resistance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Thomas wouldn't give up easily, and there would be legal complications to resolve. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of what ordinary people could accomplish when they stood together, she felt ready for whatever came next. The broken bell in the corner caught her eye, and Emma made a silent promise. Somehow, someday, they would find a way to repair that bell and let it ring out over Mercy Ridge again. It would be a symbol of their community's resurrection, a declaration that some things couldn't be bought or intimidated or destroyed. Baby Sarah stirred in her arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to take in the world with calm intelligence. This child would grow up free, educated, and loved everything Emma had dreamed of when she'd first set out for Wyoming territory. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of possibility, and for the first time in her life, Emma wasn't facing it alone. 6 months later, the sound of hammers and saws filled the valley as the new Mercy Ridge schoolhouse took shape. Built with Silas's donation and the community's labor, it was rising beside the church like a testament to what people could accomplish when they worked together toward a common goal. Emma stood in the doorway of her cottage, baby Sarah in her arms, watching her husband direct the construction crew. Silas had thrown himself into the project with the same intensity he'd once reserved for building his cattle empire, but now his energy served the community rather than just his own interests. The legal battles with Thomas Whitmore and his railroad conspirators had been resolved more quickly than anyone expected. The territorial governor's investigation had uncovered corruption reaching into multiple government offices, leading to arrests and prosecutions that made headlines throughout the West. Thomas himself was serving 2 years in territorial prison for fraud and conspiracy. More importantly, the investigation had established clear legal precedents protecting community land rights and educational facilities. What had started as a threat to one small town had become a victory for frontier communities throughout Wyoming territory. Mrs. Hart, the voice belonged to Jenny Peterson, one of Emma's brightest students, now approaching with a slate covered in careful mathematical calculations. "I finished the problems you assigned, but I think there might be more elegant solutions using the algebraic methods you showed us." Emma smiled, examining the girl's work with the pride of a teacher watching her students surpass expectations. The Mercy Ridge School had become something special. Children who might have received only basic literacy in most frontier communities were now studying advanced mathematics, classical literature, and natural sciences. "Excellent thinking, Jenny. Why don't you explore those alternative methods and present your findings to the class next week?" As Jenny hurried away, obviously excited by the mathematical challenge, Emma reflected on how much had changed since that snowy night when she'd found Silas dying in a ravine. Her act of simple compassion had rippled outward in ways she never could have imagined, transforming not just their lives, but the entire community. The schoolhouse construction was nearly complete, its bell tower waiting for the bronze bell that Silas had commissioned to replace the church's broken one. When it arrived, Mercy Ridge would have 2 bells sewn for worship, one for education, both proclaiming the community's commitment to nurturing souls and minds. Dr. Morrison approached from his rounds, his medical bag in hand, and a satisfied expression on his weathered face. At 73, he'd found new energy in serving a community that was thriving rather than merely surviving. "Mrs. Hart," he said warmly, "I've just come from the Webb Ranch. Their youngest boy recovered completely from his fever. Those medical techniques you taught me made all the difference." Emma had been sharing her father's medical knowledge with Dr. Morrison, creating an informal partnership that had improved healthcare throughout the region. Her background in medicine, combined with his decades of frontier experience, had proven invaluable during the harsh winter months. "I'm glad we could help," Emma replied. "Father always said medicine was too important to hoard knowledge. Shared was knowledge multiplied." Baby Sarah gurgled happily in her arms, a healthy 6-month-old with her mother's dark hair and her father's strong features. She was already showing signs of the intelligence that ran in both family lines, studying the world around her with intense curiosity. Miguel Santos appeared around the corner of the schoolhouse, his hat pushed back and satisfaction evident on his lined face. The foreman had become Silas's right hand in managing both ranch operations and community projects, his natural leadership abilities finally receiving the recognition they deserved. "Senora Hart," he called. "The patron wants to know if you'd like to inspect the school before we install the windows. He says the teacher should approve all the arrangements." Emma handed Sarah to Dr. Morrison and walked toward the nearly completed building with a sense of wonder. The schoolhouse was everything she'd dreamed of, and more large windows to let in natural light, a stone fireplace for warmth, built-in shelves for books and supplies, and space for 30 students if the community continued to grow. Inside, Silas was examining the installation of the blackboards with the same attention to detail he'd once reserved for cattle pens and feed troughs. When he saw Emma, his face lit up with the expression that never failed to warm her heart. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing around the spacious interior. "Will it serve our purposes?" "It's perfect," Emma said softly, seeing not just the physical structure but the dreams it represented. "The children will love having proper space to learn and grow." Silas crossed to where she stood, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Our children," he said quietly. "Sarah and all the others will teach here together." The plural wasn't accidental. They'd been discussing the possibility of more children, and Emma found herself hoping that Sarah would have siblings to share this remarkable childhood they were building in Mercy Ridge. "The Territorial Education Board wants to visit next month," Emma said. "They're considering our school as a model for other frontier communities. Imagine what we've built here could be replicated throughout Wyoming." Silas smiled at her enthusiasm, remembering the isolated man he'd been just months ago. Emma had given him more than love and family. She'd given him purpose beyond accumulating wealth, a reason to use his success for something greater than himself. The sound of an approaching wagon drew them outside, where they found Reverend Crawford returning from his weekly circuit to outlying ranches. His face was flushed with excitement as he climbed down from the driver's seat. "Wonderful news," he announced to the gathering crowd. "The territorial legislature has passed the Education Protection Act. Communities that maintain schools for 5 consecutive years will receive territorial funding for advanced education and teacher training." The news meant that Mercy Ridge's victory had become law, protecting other communities from the kind of conspiracy they'd faced. Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that their struggle had created lasting change beyond their own borders. As evening approached, the construction crew packed up their tools and headed home to their own families. Emma and Silas walked back to their cottage hand in hand, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her father's arms. Their home had expanded since the marriage. Silas had moved into the teacher's cottage, rather than expecting Emma to abandon her position for the isolation of his ranch house. It was a symbolic choice that showed how completely his priorities had shifted from wealth to family and community. Inside, Emma prepared their simple supper, while Silas played with Sarah, making silly faces that sent the baby into delighted giggles. The domestic scene would have been unimaginable to either of them a year ago, but now it felt as natural as breathing. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked as they sat down to eat, "giving up your solitary life for all this chaos and responsibility?" Silas considered the question seriously, looking around their modest home with its collection of books, baby clothes, and the general clutter of family life. "Never," he said firmly. "I spent 20 years building walls around myself, and it nearly killed me literally and figuratively. You showed me that walls aren't protection, they're prisons. This chaos, as you call it, is what makes life worth living." After supper, they took their evening walk through town, a routine that had become precious to both of them. Sarah rode in a carriage that Silas had built himself, marveling at the world with wide, wondering eyes. The schoolhouse stood silhouetted against the sunset, its bell tower reaching toward the stars. Tomorrow, work would resume on the interior finishing, and by autumn the building would be ready for the new school year. But the real measure of their success wasn't in buildings or legal victories, it was in the children who now had opportunities their parents had never dreamed possible. In families who'd learned to work together for common goals, in a community that had discovered its own strength and courage. Emma paused beside the completed foundation, where the new school bell would soon ring, remembering the broken bell that had symbolized their community's damaged dreams. Soon, a new bell would call children to learning, ring out celebrations and warnings, mark the passages of time in a place where time meant hope rather than mere survival. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked softly. "The future," Emma replied, watching Sarah sleep peacefully in her carriage. "All the children who'll attend school here, all the families who'll find opportunity in Mercy Ridge, all the lives that will be better because we chose to fight for what was right." The Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above them, vast with possibility. The harsh land that had once threatened to break them had become home. The community that had questioned Emma's worth had embraced her completely, and the man who'd closed his heart to love had opened it to family and service. As they turned back toward their cottage, Emma felt the deep satisfaction of a life lived with purpose. She'd come to Wyoming territory as a disgraced woman seeking refuge, but she'd found something far greater, a place where courage mattered more than scandal, where community could triumph over corruption, and where love could indeed conquer all. Baby Sarah stirred in her carriage, opening dark eyes that seemed to hold infinite promise. This child would grow up free and educated, surrounded by people who valued learning and integrity above wealth and convenience. She would know from birth that she was precious, wanted, and capable of anything she dreamed. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley knot, the sound of schemes and corruption, but honest commerce, bringing connection and opportunity to Wyoming territory. The railroad had come to the region through legitimate channels, benefiting communities rather than destroying them. Emma Hart smiled as she walked home with her family, understanding finally that her story had never been about shame or scandal. It had been about redemption, courage, and the simple truth that sometimes the most broken-seeming people could build the most beautiful lives. The schoolhouse bell would ring soon, calling children to learn and grow and dream. And in that sound would be the echo of a snowy night when two strangers found each other in a storm, proving that sometimes the greatest rescues were mutual and sometimes the most unlikely love could weather any tempest.